May it please this honorable court, defense counsel, and ladies and gentlemen of the jury. A month of mayhem, a month of devastating violence, a month of chaos, a month of destruction across Hampton roads, a month of death, 5 murders, 4 shootings, 4 other people, all in the name of the 9 Trey Gangsters, a violent Bloods street gang that wanted power, money, and respect. And the evidence in this case is going to show the members and the associates of this gang were willing to do just about anything for power, money, and respect, including murder, including shootings and armed robbery and drug dealing. And this month of mayhem, which occurred from around Thanksgiving to Christmas of 2015, cost almost every city in Southampton roads, from Chesapeake to Virginia Beach to Norfolk and Portsmouth. And the crimes were so frequent and so diverse that the police responding to them at that time did not realize that it was all being perpetuated by one single gang. The evidence is going to show that this violence finally came to an end on December 27th of 2015 after what appeared to be at the time an isolated armed robbery of a Shell gas station. You're going to learn there was a vehicle pursuit of the 2 suspects, pursuit on foot, and that officers of the Portsmouth Police Department apprehended 2 men. But they also recovered key pieces of evidence. They recovered the men's cell phones, which were rich with data tying them not only to their gang, but to the crimes in this case. But they also recovered a .40 caliber Glock semi-automatic firearm, and from the getaway car, a .380 caliber casing. And I start with this armed robbery because the evidence that these officers recovered helped investigators put all of the pieces of a puzzle together in this case. Now, one of the 2 men who robbed the Shell gas station that night and was arrested, the evidence is going to show is defendant Nathaniel Mitchell, who is seated at the back table. His street name is Savage. And with him that night was a man by the name of Anthony Foyer, who went by a street name of Bull or Ace. And the evidence is going to show that these 2 men were members of 9 Trey and that they were the primary shooters in this case. You're going to hear from a sergeant in the Portsmouth Police Department's gang unit, and this sergeant made a very important decision early on because of what he saw on the surveillance video of this armed robbery. These men were wearing red bandanas, and they had tattoos indicative of membership in a gang. So he made a very important decision early on, and that was to monitor their calls while they were in custody awaiting their trial. And he listened to those calls, and he began learning more and more and more about their crimes and about their involvement in their gang. One of the things that he learns is a letter that the evidence will show defendant Mitchell was trying to send to a fellow gang member to find out who the Shell gas station clerk was, find out where she lived, intimidate her, and make sure she doesn't show up at trial on us. Or, using his words, just kill the bitch. Now, Portsmouth police intercepted this letter and they partnered with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, and they stake out that court date. And sure enough, fellow members of his gang show up. A man by the name of L.B., his legal name is Alvon Davis, and you'll meet him in this trial. And they take steps to ensure the security and safety of this Shell gas station clerk. Then the case goes from being a state case to a federal case. And these men, defendant Mitchell and Foyer, they begin using the phones over and over again. And what becomes very evident to the investigative team is that these men are not operating on their own. The evidence is going to show that they have a superior. They have a boss. And that man is defendant Antonio Simmons, seated right behind me. And defendant Simmons has a street name Murdoch, or you may hear him being referred to as Doc. One of the first big breaks in the case is defendant Mitchell agrees to speak to the FBI, and he admits on video, a video that you'll see, that he committed the armed robbery of the Shell gas station with Mr. Foyer on December 27th. And it really wasn't too surprising to the investigators because of the magnitude of the evidence in that case, but he gives them new information. He tells them that he was involved in 2 shootings just prior to the Shell gas station, and he also tells them about a shooting that occurred at a Virginia Beach nightclub. And when asked why that was, he said it was for the glory name. It is what it is. And then he gives some critical information about one of the murders in the case. He tells them about a rental car that his fellow gang member LB used that the law enforcement team was able to tie back to a murder. And then after this interview, Mr. Mitchell starts using the phone over and over again. Now, the second big break in the case occurs when defendant Simmons is arrested about 3 months later, March of 2016. It appears this was an isolated traffic stop. He's in possession of a Smith & Wesson firearm. He's in the possession of crack cocaine, and heroin. So he's arrested and he's in custody awaiting his trial. And like Mr. Mitchell, he's using the phone over and over and over again. And at first, he uses some coded language, but eventually he speaks openly, and it becomes very evident that he's got no problem doing gang business over the phones. And the investigators who listen to hundreds of these phone calls see 3 themes emerge. First, he's very concerned about the traffic stop, the gun, and the drugs. So much so that he made attempts to get somebody to write a false affidavit claiming ownership of that gun, a gun that he is not lawfully allowed to possess. The second theme that comes across is that he has a drug debt that he's very concerned about with his boss, a guy who goes by the street name of Ditto. Very concerned about money and this drug debt. And then the third theme that emerges is this rivalry that he has with another leader of another gang set, a guy named Skino. Now, defendant Simmons also provides an important break in the case because he also speaks to the FBI and he admits he is a certified 9 Trey Gangster. He admits he had held a high rank. He admits he had members that were subordinate to him, that were to follow his orders. He admits to the gun and the drugs that were in the car, but he doesn't take responsibility for any of the crimes of violence that you're about to hear. But interestingly, he knows about them, and he tells the FBI that members who were subordinate to him had committed murders, and he tells them about why they committed some of these murders. Now, what I want to do is provide a roadmap here. I want to highlight some of the key evidence in this case. We're going to talk about charges generally and some important legal concepts, and then we're going to go into these 10 crimes of violence. Everything that you're about to hear has occurred in the Eastern District of Virginia. Earlier I mentioned on December 27th of 2015, Portsmouth police, they recover some very important ballistic evidence in this case. They recover a .40 caliber firearm, which the evidence is going to show was used by Anthony Foyer, and a .380 caliber casing that was found in defendant Mitchell's getaway car, a car that his girlfriend owned, a car that he used multiple times in multiple crimes of violence that you'll see on surveillance videos. And for those that don't have a background in forensics or ballistics, you're going to hear from an expert. But the casing that was found in defendant Mitchell's car, that's what's left over after a bullet is fired through a gun. A shell casing is left over, and that the labs are able to take this evidence and they're able to put it into their systems, and they're able to match it to other bullets or other shell casings that had been fired. And they do that in this case. And this lab makes a staggering discovery. Staggering. That .40 caliber Glock and that .380 caliber casing they recover are tied to almost every crime scene but one. To 10 crime scenes. Either the .40 Glock was there, or the .380, or in many cases both. Second, the cell phones were recovered from these two men after the Shell gas station robbery. And you're going to hear from a cell phone expert, and he is going to talk to you about cell phone towers and how when you're using your phone, whether you're on the phone or you're using an application, that they're bouncing off cell phone towers. They're bouncing off quadrants of the cell phone towers, and the quadrants can put you in a certain place at a certain time. So he's going to walk through that, and you're going to hear evidence that Defendant Mitchell's cell phone is at many of the places, these crimes of violence, at the time that they were occurring, and that their phones were also rich with data, these text messages and these Facebook messages that talk about these crimes and talk about their involvement in a gang. Next, you're going to hear from a fingerprint expert. He's going to tell you about a thumbprint belonging to Defendant Malik Lassiter, who sits the furthest away from you, that was found on a rearview mirror of a Lexus where a man was murdered. And then fifth, you're going to hear eyewitnesses' testimony. You're going to hear victims who've lost loved ones. You're going to hear people who have been shot. You're going to hear from eyewitnesses. You're going to hear from police detectives. You're going to hear from a lot of witnesses in this case, and I invite you to take notes. It's a lot of names and there's a lot of facts. And then you're going to be presented with recordings, phone calls and interviews of Defendant Simmons and Defendant Mitchell. The grand jury has returned an indictment charging these three defendants for their involvement in a RICO conspiracy. That's Racketeering, Influence, and Corrupt Organizations Act. And what is a conspiracy? It's an agreement between two or more people to commit an illegal activity. In this case, a racketeering activity. Murder, attempted murder, robbery, and drug trafficking. And you're going to hear evidence that members and associates of the 9 Trey Gangsters, including these three defendants, committed these types of crimes as part of the evidence. And as you consider the evidence, remember that a defendant does not need to personally commit a crime, each of these crimes. Let me say that again, because it's very important. A defendant does not need to commit each and every one of these crimes or even a particular crime. In a RICO conspiracy, all the defendants have to do is agree to the conspiracy. Now, to prove a RICO conspiracy, we've got to prove that an enterprise exists. What's an enterprise? An enterprise is an entity that has continuity, it has some kind of structure and a common purpose. So, as it pertains to continuity, you're going to hear evidence from a gang expert, and he's going to tell you that the United Blood Nation is a collective of gangs, and it was started in 1993. And the very name of 9 Trey is from the year of their founding, so it's been in existence for a while. And then, as it pertains to structure, you're going to hear evidence that here in Hampton Roads, there are 3 lines of 9 Trey. So 9 Trey, like a subsidiary to a corporation or an army, a company brigade to a division, or a cruiser to an air carrier strike group, there's structure here. And within each of these lines, you have a leader. The evidence is going to show Defendant Simmons was one of those leaders. And under those leaders are generals, 5-star, 4, 3, 2, 1. And under the generals, you have soldiers, and then under the soldiers, you have scraps. Those are those associates. Those are those recruits. The probationary members that are trying to make their way into full membership of the gang. The evidence is going to show that Defendant Mitchell was a general who took orders from Defendant Simmons, and the evidence is going to show that Defendant Lassiter was considered one of those scraps, one of those associates trying to solidify his position in the gang. Now, there's also a number of rules, 31 rules to be exact. And we know about these rules because a search warrant was executed on Defendant Mitchell's home, and these rules were found. And among those rules, there's a theme of respect. Respect is paramount in 9 Trey. Respect for your superiors, and if you don't obey the orders of your superiors, you can be punished. You can be frozen out of the gang, you can be kicked out of your line, or you can be killed. And there's a rule preventing snitches. Snitches are those people who cooperate with the United States. The United States, the federal government, is their enemy. Part of their rules are to learn federal laws. And then another key rule is to put in work. And I'm not talking about clocking in and clocking out. I'm talking about work to generate money for the gang, or work like crimes of violence that enhance the prestige and the respect and the power of the gang. And they also have specific colors. They have identifiers. Red is their color, and they have distinct tattoos like 5 stars, 9-3. You may see that on some of the hands. You're going to learn they don't like the letter C because C refers to their rival gang, the Crips. And so they don't use C in their communications. They use letters like K or X. And they have a lot of lingo that you're going to hear throughout the duration of this trial. They refer to firearms as shoelaces or Jim Jays. And references to food, to eating, or to a meal are references to punishment or even a killing. And you're going to hear evidence in this case that Defendant Simmons said mash the gas. And that is a term that witnesses understood to mean to kill other people. They love the term Billy. Billy is synonymous with 9 Trey. They refer to themselves as Billy. What they do is for the glory of Billy. Now, as it relates to common purpose, they enrich their members through drug trafficking, through identity theft, through robbery, and then expanding their power and territory through the use of fear and violence. So we've addressed RICO, and now I'm going to address VICAR. That's an acronym for Violent Crimes in Aid of Racketeering. The shootings in this case are charged under the RICO conspiracy, but they're also charged under VICAR. The government's got to prove that the defendants committed the alleged crime, here the shootings or the murders, and that they did so for the purpose of either gaining entry into the gang, maintaining their position, or moving up. And this requirement is also satisfied if you conclude that the defendant committed the violent crime because they believed it was expected of them by reason of their membership in or in furtherance of their membership in the gang. So let's cover the third and final piece of this roadmap. These are the crimes that were committed in this month of mayhem. And this map represents where the 5 people were murdered, where the 4 people were shot, and where the armed robbery occurred. And the evidence is going to show that the 9 Trey gangsters were involved in all 10 of these crime scenes. Scene 1. It was November 25th of 2015. Linda Lassiter is at her daughter's house. And just so there's no confusion, Linda and Brooke Lassiter and their family have absolutely no relation to Defendant Lassiter. No connection, no family connection there. So Linda Lassiter is in the kitchen in the front of this home. She's making Thanksgiving dinner for her family. Her daughter and her son are in the back. Her grandchildren are in the back of the house. But unbeknownst to Linda Lassiter, earlier that day, in front of her home, a member of the 9 Trey gangsters was disrespected. So, as she's in the kitchen, gunfire erupts. Through the kitchen window, through the front door, bullets are riddling through her home. She races to the back of the home as adults are jumping on screaming children, and miraculously, nobody was killed. Now, Linda Lassiter survived that shooting, and she agreed to speak to the police. And you're going to hear evidence that Anthony Foyer found out that people were saying that he was the shooter. Less than a month later, Linda Lassiter was murdered. And the evidence is going to show that Linda Lassiter was murdered by defendant Mitchell. .380 caliber bullets were found in her body. .40 caliber casings from a gun Anthony Foyer used were found at her murder scene. December 10, 2015, 26-year-old Tariq Tynes was murdered. The evidence is going to show that Mr. Foyer, at point-blank range, put a gun to his friend's head and pulled the trigger. And this is the one scene where there are no ballistics because the force of that power of that gun was so strong, it went right through his brain. And why was he killed? The evidence is going to show he was killed for money. Money for defendant Simmons, so that defendant Simmons could pay off a drug debt to his boss, Ditto. Mr. Tynes was known to have money and lots of it. There were pictures of him with money on social media. He had nice jewelry, including a Cuban link necklace. He drove a Lexus. But he was also a friend of Anthony Foyer's, and Anthony Foyer saw an opportunity. And you're going to see text messages in this case between Anthony Foyer and defendant Simmons. And Anthony Foyer says, "I'm with the meal, so it's guaranteed." And defendant Simmons writes back, "Geez," which you're going to hear means okay. And so Anthony Foyer kills Tariq Tynes, and defendant Simmons writes him a text, "Bring me the money or dead." You're going to hear evidence that Anthony Foyer drove that Lexus around for days with Tariq Tynes' body in the trunk, and then he showed it off like a bloody trophy to defendant Lassiter. And instead of running away from this gang, defendant Lassiter took even more steps to get into it. And you're going to hear from that fingerprint expert, and he's going to tell you about Anthony Foyer and Malik Lassiter's fingerprint on the rearview mirror of that Lexus. And defendant Lassiter denied to the police, denied to the FBI, that he had ever been in that Lexus. You're going to hear from Mr. Tynes' family. You're going to hear from his siblings. These witnesses will tell you very candidly about their brother. He had a family. He had a job. He also sold marijuana. He also had a .380 caliber firearm. And this is very important because it's not until after his murder that casings from this .380 start showing up. And the evidence is going to show that Anthony Foyer, after he killed Tariq Tynes, gave that .380 to defendant Mitchell. You're going to hear from one of the defendants, fellow 9 Trey gang members, Alvon Davis. And he's going to tell you about how he helped Anthony Foyer dump Tariq Tynes' body unceremoniously into a ditch in Chesapeake. And all of this was done so that the defendant Simmons could get the money he needed to pay off a debt to Ditto, his higher-ranking 9 Trey. In fact, even Mr. Simmons admits to the FBI that Foyer killed Mr. Tynes for money and that the gang needed money. 5 days after Mr. Tynes' murder, there's another murder. This time it's 27-year-old Vandelay Mercer. She's with a man named Roosevelt Foster, who was shot but survived. You're going to hear from him in this trial. He's going to tell you, he'll testify, that just prior to this shooting, he and Miss Mercer were at a location purchasing drugs. And you're going to see text messages from defendant Simmons to his soldier, to Anthony Foyer, saying it's on at the gambling spot. And Foyer writes back, GZ. Okay. And defendant Simmons writes back, it's on right now. Foyer's cell phone location puts him near the scene of this murder, as do the casings of his .40 caliber Glock. But at this murder, for the first time, casings from a .380 caliber firearm are found. You're going to be presented with defendant Mitchell's statement to the FBI that he was with Mr. Foyer and fellow gang member Alvon Davis that night, and Mr. Davis had rented a rental car that the FBI found the night of the murder through the surveillance videos of the tunnel. And then you're also going to hear from Defendant Simmons' interview, where he tells the FBI that on that very day he had sent Foyer to go do a jug. And that's terminology you're going to hear that means a robbery. In the early morning hours of December 20th, this would end up being the bloodiest night in this month of mayhem. 5 days after Vandelay is murdered, on December 20th, this is when Linda Lassiter and Wayne Davis are murdered. This is the same woman who was making that Thanksgiving dinner, the same woman Foyer had nearly killed just a couple weeks before, who had spoken to police. They were murdered while they were in Wayne's car. There's even security footage of the aftermath, because Wayne Davis's last desperate act was to floor the accelerator and get away from the two men that were shooting him. And you're going to see, as this car races down the road, just before it goes off screen and crashes into a mailbox, Mr. Mitchell's cell phone data puts him here in the vicinity at the time of this murder. Casings from a .40 Glock and bullets from a .380 found in her body. After this double homicide, Mr. Mitchell and Mr. Foyer decide to go clubbing in Virginia Beach, go to the Aqua Lounge. But before they go to the Aqua Lounge, they pick up a fellow gang member. His name is Dognuts. His real name is Dante Brian. You'll hear from him in this trial, and Dante Brian drives Defendant Mitchell's girlfriend's car to the club. You're going to see him get out of this car, and then after folks from the club start leaving, Defendant Mitchell and Anthony Foyer go up to this car and they start shooting at it. And inside that car is a first-class petty officer of the United States Navy. And the mistake he made that night was wearing red. He wore a Chicago Bulls hat, a red shirt, red shoes, from head to foot. And there's a term for that in 9 Trey. It's called false flagging. Because first-class petty officer McKnight was not in a gang, and that can be perceived as a disrespectful to the gang. And for that kind of disrespect, he's shot through the arm, he's shot through the legs, and you're going to see this. You're going to see it because it's on video. There's a video of the shooting, and he gets maybe a block or two away before he can no longer. And medics get to him, they cut open his clothes, they're able to save his life. And casings and bullets from the .40 caliber and the .380, the same ones that match what were found a week later, are found at this scene. Defendant Mitchell's cell phone puts him at the location of this shooting, and the men's movement are tracked through the surveillance tunnels from Portsmouth into Norfolk and into Virginia Beach, and then onto another crime of violence into Chesapeake later that night. Before I get to that, though, they drop off Dognuts in Norfolk, and there's 2 other pieces of evidence that you need to hear about. First, just a day or 2 after Virginia Beach, after this Aqua Lounge shooting, Virginia Beach Police Department decides to put this video out to the public. They give it to the press because they want to find the suspects that may be involved in this case. And you're going to hear evidence that Defendant Mitchell shows this video to his girlfriend's stepfather and her girlfriend. And he brags about it. He points himself out as the shooter. And then he tries to sell his stepfather, or his girlfriend's stepfather, a firearm. He's not the only one bragging about this. You're going to hear a testimony that Defendant Simmons saw this video and he was showing fellow gang members, "These are my guys." And in his interview with the FBI, he admits knowing about this shooting, and he told the FBI that Mr. Foyer's motive for the shooting was that he felt disrespected at the club that night. So we're still in the early morning hours of December 20th. It's about 2 o'clock in the morning, and across town in a residential neighborhood, Paul McDuffie, who had just gotten off a late shift, is sitting in his car playing on his phone. And the next thing he knows, his car is shot up. And this close to his head, his ears is blown off by a .40 caliber Glock. A .40 caliber Glock casing that matches the casing or the gun that's found a week later. Inside that home, Paul's father was sleeping on the couch, and he hears what he describes as a sound of a cannon. And he gets up and he goes to the peephole and he looks through and he sees his son's car. He gets his shoes on, he opens the door, and his son falls into him and falls onto the ground. He tries to ask his son what happened. His son cannot hear and doesn't respond. They call 911 and he's saved. Very next day, December 21st, 2015, 25-year-old Jamisha Roberts leaves her home, gets on the bus, and goes to work. And by work, I'm talking about the Starbucks at the Norfolk Airport. And she does her shift at Starbucks, but she never gets on her bus that night. She is walking down Robin Hood Road, and she's gunned down and she's murdered. And the evidence is going to show that she was murdered by Defendant Mitchell. .380 caliber casings found at the scene, .380 caliber bullets found in Jamisha's body. You're going to see her Starbucks shirt with the hole where the bullet went through that killed her. You're going to see Mitchell's cell phone that puts him in the vicinity of this murder within 30 minutes of the murder. And you're going to hear from a witness who's going to testify that Mitchell murdered this woman because she was on the wrong side of the road. The evidence is that these people thought this was a game. Defendant Mitchell told him that his buddy Foyer was still one up on him. This was a competition to them. And even their boss, Defendant Simmons, bragged about them. 6 days later, this is when this month of mayhem finally comes to an end, but not before several acts of violence. At around 9 o'clock this night in Portsmouth, the evidence is going to show that Defendant Mitchell, Defendant Lassiter, Alvon Davis, Anthony Foyer, acting at the order of Defendant Simmons, go out looking to mash the gas on members of a rival 9-tray line. And they went out looking for those men, but they came up short. Now, before I tell you about the attempted murder of Sparkle Morris, it's important that you learn the backdrop of this rivalry that Defendant Simmons had with this man named Skino. The evidence is going to show that the rivalry was born because of something called line jumping. There was a gang member named Shadas, and he was in Skino's line, one of the 3 lines here in Hampton Roads, and Skino kicked him out of the line. In fact, he wanted him robbed and killed. But Defendant Simmons, evidence is going to show, took him in his line because Shadas was good at making money. He was good at popping checks, identity theft, and Defendant Simmons wanted him. So this causes a rivalry. Skino doesn't like this. And this gets back to Skino. And you're going to hear evidence that Skino, who is in a prison in Colorado, who still runs his gang from Colorado, his gang members still put money on his phone so that he can have contact with them. And he has people locally who still run his day-to-day operations. You're going to hear about a general named Blacko who does those kind of things. And during one of these recorded calls, a call that you'll hear, Skino is on the phone with one of his generals. And with his general is Defendant Mitchell. But unbeknownst to Skino, Defendant Mitchell patches in Defendant Simmons, so Simmons can overhear what Skino is saying. And Skino says "F what Doc says," Doc being Defendant Simmons. And he says it over and over again. And Defendant Simmons is enraged. Taking Shadas is no longer good enough. He raises the bar. And the evidence is going to show that shortly after that he finds out about a party where scraps from Skino's line are hanging out, and he goes to that party and he tells all of them, You are all under me from now on. Well, the evidence is going to show that there was one man who didn't like that. So defendant Simmons assaults him and pulls out a gun on him. And shortly after this party, he tells members of his gang to mash the gas. And that's the order that leads to the attempted murder of Sparkle Morris. Why? Because while defendant Mitchell and defendant Lassiter and Anthony Foyer and Alvon Davis were looking for Blanco and members of Skino's lines, they come up short. They couldn't find them. They got desperate. And the last place they remember seeing Blanco was at Sparkle Morris's house. They go to Sparkle Morris's house, they knock on the door, and Sparkle answers and she says, "You got the wrong house." And their reply is to start shooting her, multiple times. And you will see this woman not only because she's going to testify, you're going to see her because a Portsmouth police officer had his body camera activated as he's responding to the scene, and she's lying on the ground with a bullet in her chest and her arm up, and she's crying out, "I can't breathe." And the evidence is going to show because of a rivalry that this man had with another gang member. Now, 40 caliber and 380 shell casings are recovered from the scene. You're going to be presented with cellular location data from Mr. Mitchell's phone, putting him near the scene at the time of the shooting. But the FBI wants to find out more about this order. So the FBI wires up a car, undercover video, and they get a confidential paid informant who is embedded in Mr. Simmons' gang, and they get him to make a controlled purchase of drugs. And as he's sitting in this car with that undercover video recording, one that you'll see, Mr. Simmons explains his order to mash the gas. Now, as defendants Mitchell, Lassiter, and Foyer are running from the home of Sparkle Morris, there's a 77-year-old resident. He's in his home. He's washing the dishes, and he overhears these shots. So he goes outside and he sees several men running by his building. And then they see him, and so they turn their guns on him and they start shooting at him. They start shooting at an occupied apartment building on Reed Street, an occupied building where there are 11 people living in 4 units. They duck for cover as bullets come raining into this home. One bullet goes over the crib of a 2-year-old that is sleeping across the room from his 5-year-old brother's head. Their mother is running into this room as bullets are flying through, as debris is falling from the ceiling and through the walls, cradling her children, running into a bathroom in the middle of the apartment where she thought it might be safe as these men are running by shooting up this apartment building. But defendant Mitchell admits to the FBI that he was running to the car, but he claims that Mr. Foyer was the only shooter. But the eyewitnesses remember 3 men, 2 of them shooting as they were running past the apartment building. But that night, that bloody night, is not yet over. Now, Mr. Mitchell and Foyer, they go to a Shell gas station to rob it. It's all recorded. You're going to get to see the surveillance footage. They go in there. They tell the clerk to give them the money. They threaten to shoot her. She frantically tells them she's got to hit a button in order to get the cash out. And then Mr. Foyer starts counting down. 10, 9, 8, 7. And defendant Mitchell starts joining in on the count. 6, 5, 4, 3. And now before they get down to the end of the count, she's able to get the cash out. And with their red bandanas, they race out of that Shell gas station and they get into Mr. Mitchell's car and they drive away with lights out. And that's when the police find this vehicle. They try to pull it over. It doesn't stop. They get into a vehicle pursuit. It goes into the Cavalier Manor neighborhood of Chesapeake or of Portsmouth. These men get out of the car. They go in different directions. You're going to hear from the officer and his canine that tracked Mr. Mitchell down to a shed. didn't know if he was armed, opens the door anyway, and he and his canine successfully apprehend Mr. Mitchell. You're going to hear from another officer from the Portsmouth police who sees Mr. Foyer running across some yards, chases after him, goes over a fence, and is able to apprehend Mr. Foyer. Their phones, their surveillance video, the shell clerk, all put them at the scene of the robbery. And in fact, just moments before Mr. Foyer is taken into custody, or before he's caught by the police, the last cell phone call he ever makes, 51 seconds, is to Defendant Simmons. You're going to hear that Mr. Mitchell and Mr. Foyer pled guilty to that armed robbery in a prior case. Mr. Mitchell admitted to his attempt to get a fellow gang member to find out who the clerk was and to put the fear in her heart so she wouldn't come to trial on us. Let her know that if she shows up again, that she will be dealt with, or just kill the bitch. I want to conclude this opening presentation by focusing on Defendant Simmons, because the evidence is going to show that he was a very ambitious man, a man driven by the glory name of Billy, driven by power, money, and respect. And the evidence is going to show that while he was incarcerated about a year ago, he found out that witnesses were going to testify against him, they were going to cooperate against him, and he was furious about this. And he said that he was going to start cutting the tongues out of all the snitches. That wasn't the only thing he did while he was in custody. He also jumps his chain of command and he writes a letter to his boss's boss, to the top guy in 9 Trey, a guy who goes by the name of Magoo. And in this letter, he makes the case for why he should be in charge of all the 9 Treys in Hampton Roads. But not only that, of all of Virginia, and suggests Maryland too. You'll see this letter because it was intercepted by the law enforcement team. You'll get to evaluate it. His desire for power and respect. But his ambition was short-lived because members of his gang were just killing too many people. And at the end of this trial, the evidence will show that while they wanted power, money, and respect, what their legacy really left was death, destruction, and mayhem. And with all these evidence that the United States is going to provide you in this case, you will be able to find beyond a reasonable doubt that these men are guilty. Thank you.